Hilchos Terumos Perek Chamishi, the laws of the Truma separation, chapter 5. The Rambam begins, Halacha Aleph, Ein termin ela min hayafe. You're only allowed to take the Truma from the most beautiful and the most choice portion of your crop. Shenemar, because the verse, when it describes separation of Truma, it says, Baharimchem eschelboy mimenu. When you separate its fatty part from it. Which means that there's an absolute obligation to take the nicest fruit. The Ramban, Nachmanides, argues on this. He says as long as all the produce is of one quality, you can take it for the Kohen. Let's say you have bad quality stuff. Can you take bad quality Truma for bad quality crop? So the Ramban says yes. But the Rambam is of the opinion that Truma can only be taken from Yafeh, only from choice portions. The Rabbi has a whole talk where he explains that they have a more fundamental argument of whether this is part of the general obligation to give the most choice to God. At any rate, that's the basic obligation. The Rebbe also used to say there's a lesson here, that your Truma, we don't have crops, right? We're not farmers, we don't have produce, but you know what we do have? We have different hours in the day. We have choice hours and less choice hours. The choice hours are in the morning. When you wake up in the morning, you're at your freshest, you're at your best. That's what has to be Truma to Hashem. Yes, when you wake up in the morning and you're the most strong and vigorous, those hours should be given to Hashem. To daven, to learn as we're doing now. Says the Rambam, Ein sham kohen, teirem min hamiskayim. Now, if there's no Kohen in your vicinity, so anyway, you're not going to be able to give the Truma to the Kohen anytime soon. Teirem min hamiskayim, it's better to take Truma from what will last longer, even if you have a perishable choice material. So let's say on the screen, you have, because I was about to give the example of figs. You have fresh figs, you have dried figs. The fresh figs have the advantage of being fresh and more choice. The dried figs have the advantage of being long-lasting. So the question is, which one do you give? So the Rambam says, Ketzad, what does this look like? If you have a pile that has figs, but in this pile there are fresh figs and there are dried figs. So ideally, you should give to the Kohen the fresh figs. But if there's no Kohen around, it's actually better to take the dried figs and it'll cover the fresh figs. And later when you find the Kohen, you'll give him the dried figs. If in your house the custom was to always make fresh figs into dried figs, you would dry them out on the rooftops. So if you usually make your fresh figs into dried figs, then you may take Truma from the fresh figs to cover the dried figs, even if there's no Kohen, because you're anyway is going to turn those fresh figs into dried figs before they're given to the Kohen. But if there's a Kohen in your vicinity, if there's a Kohen in your vicinity, you're not allowed to take the dried figs to cover the fresh figs, even if it's a place where they always make the fresh figs into dried figs. Because when you have a Kohen, the first choice is fresh. Choice, that's what you give to the Kohen. Halacha Beis. Here's another element of giving the better. What do you do if you have a small whole onion and a big half an onion? Which should you give to the Kohen? Says the Rambam, Termin Batzel Shalem Afal Pishu Katan. It's better to separate as Truma a complete onion, even if it's small. Avaloi Chatzi Batzel Afal Pishu Gadol, but never, or rather than, a half an onion, even if it's big. And another law that relates to this, B'chol Makayim Ein Termin Mimin Al She'enei Minai. In all places, you're not allowed to separate Truma from one species onto another. It could be that I didn't explain this principle well yesterday, but the point of Truma is that from all your crops, you need to separate 2% and give it to the Kohen. So what if a farmer is producing multiple types of crops? He might be tempted to say, let me take all my crops into one room, my grain, and my vegetables, and my fruits, and my wine, and my oil, and I'll add up the sum total of everything, and from everything I'll give 2%. Not from every individual species. I'll give from the totality of my crops 2%. Says the Torah, no. Every individual species needs to be covered with its own Truma. So you have wine, 2% of the wine goes to the Kohen. You have tomatoes, 2% of the tomatoes goes to the Kohen. You have potatoes, same thing. Ein termin mimin al she'ein mina. You cannot take truma from one species onto the other. Shanamar, because it says, Torah specifically specifies, you have to give truma kadagan min hagoyren, v'chamlea min hayokef, like grain from the granary, and like produce from the wine vat, which means that every type of produce requires its own truma. V'im taram in truma se truma, so much so that if you did separate 2%, you took it only from the wheat, but you wanted it to cover all of your species, it's not a truma. You have to go back to the wine, to the oil, and take truma again. Halacha Gimel, so now we have to define what's a species. Every time we have laws that relate to species, we have to define what's a species. At the beginning of the book, we had a whole section of laws on kilayim, right? You can't mix species. So we had a whole chapter where the Rambam defined what's called different species. This lettuce and that lettuce, this cucumber, that cucumber. So the Rambam begins and says over here also we have to define some species. Hakishus v'hamalafafine. Kishus is usually translated as zucchini, but the more accurate translation is this guy. Call it a cucumis mellow. I don't know the proper English word for this, Latin word. Looks very similar to a cucumber. See, that's the cucumber, classic cucumber. This is the kishus. So the Rambam says, for the laws of truma, both of these are considered to be min echad. They're both one species. In other words, if you have a pile of cucumbers and a pile of these guys, you can take 2% from the total and give it to the Kohen. Similarly, kol min chitim echadu, all types of wheat are considered to be one species. Kol min te'enim ugregres udvela echad, all types of figs and dried figs and cakes of figs is all considered to be one species. V'toyda mizal zeh, you can take truma from one species and cover them all. However, v'kolshu kilayim b'chaveiroi, any species which, had it been planted with another species, would be considered kilayim, would be considered a forbidden mixture, as we defined in the laws of kilayim. So they're also called different species for these laws. Lo yisra mizal zeh, you cannot take truma from one such species to cover the other such species. Afilu min hayafa al hara, even if what you're doing is actually going to end up giving the Kohen more choice produce. Let's say you had wheat and barley, right? Wheat and barley are an example of what's kilayim. The Rambam will give the example right now. Ketzad, what does this mean? You have, as in this picture, you have 50 pounds, 50 sa'ah of wheat and 50 sa'ah of barley in one home. Okay, maybe not so accurate, this is in the outside. The case would actually be within a room, inside one room. So you have a total of 100 pounds. You might be inclined to say, look, wheat is better quality than barley. So instead of taking 2% from the wheat and 2% from the barley, 1 pound from each, let me just take 2 pounds of wheat to give to the Kohen as truma, and that'll cover all 100 pounds. The person separates for all of the grain. 2 sa'ah of wheat, ain't on truma. Those 2 sa'ah are not truma, because wheat and barley, had they been planted together, are considered kilayim with each other, and therefore the truma obligation cannot be exempted by one species from the other, even if you're taking a better one for the worse one. But if 2 species together would not be considered to be kilayim, you're allowed to plant them together, then you could exempt one species by taking truma from the other, so long as the one you're taking truma from is the choicer of the two. It's the yafa versus the other one, which is ra. It's the nicer one, the better one, versus the other one, which is lower quality. But you cannot take a lower quality and use it to exempt higher quality species, even if those 2 species, had they been planted together, would be allowed. In this case, though, if you took the truma from the lower quality to exempt the higher quality species after the fact, it's truma. There's one exception. There's one exception of a mixture of species which is allowed to be planted, but cannot be exempted with truma, and that is the zunin. Zunin is called darnel. It's a type of grain very similar to wheat. When it came to the laws of kilayim, you're allowed to plant darnel and wheat. But here, if you were to take truma from darnel to exempt the wheat, it wouldn't work even after the fact. Because darnel is not food that's edible to human beings. It's not meant for humans, it's meant for animals. Halacha Dalet. Says the Rambam another rule that relates to truma. Even if you have one big pile of the same species of produce, but they're at 2 different stages of the work that relates to them. Every produce goes through a process before it's ready to be eaten. So you have some of the produce has already had all its work completed. Other parts of the produce haven't yet had their work completed. You're not allowed to take truma from the completed produce to exempt the uncompleted produce. Or even if you have two parts of the produce that are both incomplete, you cannot take truma from one incomplete produce to exempt another incomplete produce. And certainly not taking truma from an incomplete produce to exempt a complete produce. The only time you can take truma is if all the produce is in the most completed stage. Shenemar, because it says the same verse as before, Kadogon min hagoyda and bechamalea min hayakef. The truma needs to be ready to go grain from the granary and ready to go produce from the vat. Min hagomer al hagomer. You have to take truma from completed produce to exempt other completed produce. The imtarmu trumas on truma. After the fact, though, if you mixed complete and incomplete produce and you took truma, it's all okay. Halacha hey me'emasai termin es hagoyda. From this perspective, knowing as we do that the produce has to be complete, so when is grain in a granary considered to be complete? Misha Yivrar says that Rambam, the moment you finish sorting the chaff from the kernels. Barar miktsas, if you already sorted part of the produce. Termin min habarar al she'ene barar, you can take truma from that which is sorted to exempt that which is not sorted. Hamachnis shibalin mutech beisay la'asesan mililos. A person who brings in wheat stalks into his home, planning to use the stalks of grain as they are. Usually you take out the kernels and you make the kernels into flour, which you make into bread. But other people, or other times, you could actually use the stalk as is to make like a snack of like toasted grain. You would take the full kernel with the chaff on top of it and toast it and eat it. So the person is bringing in stalks into his home to make them into this food known as husked grain. So here, relative to you, the produce at this stage is already considered complete. So you can already take the truma from the stalks at this stage. At what point may we take truma from the wine press? The moment the people that are pressing the wine walk through the vat or through the press horizontally and vertically. This is a picture of a smaller wine pit where they're pressing the wine. But imagine if it was a much bigger pit. So the moment they take a walk this way and that way, they've already begun to press the wine. At this point, the wine is considered already in some form complete, and it's already able to have truma taken from it. At what point can you take truma from olives, mishayit anu, once they're loaded onto the press? So this is a picture of a smaller olive press, where it's just the olives and you have a little wheel rolling around to press the olives. But the more elaborate olive presses would actually have a series of these weights. These stones over here would actually be flipped the other way. They would be like kind of wheels resting on the olives. They'd be loaded one on top of the other for a series of a couple of wheels. And then on top of that, there would go this wooden beam which would press down those wheels onto the olives and press the oil out of the olives. So the moment those weights were loaded on to the olives, at that point, you're already eligible to take truma from these olives. Halacha zayin, another rule when it comes to truma, ein termin min hatoher ala tameh. You cannot take truma from pure, ritually pure produce to exempt ritually impure produce. The intaram truma say truma. If you did take such truma, it's a good truma in the end after the fact. Halacha l'meisha misinai, there's a tradition, a halacha received directly from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai, that this law, that you cannot take truma from ritually pure produce to exempt ritually impure produce, is only if the two elements of produce are separate. But let's say she'igel shel dvela shenitma miktsasa. If you have a fig cake, they used to press figs together to make a fig cake, and part of it became impure, so it's one unit, one entity. You can actually, even initially, take truma from the pure part to exempt the impure part of the same cake. Not only the cake, which is actually one body. Even if it's a bunch of vegetables, where it's a wheat pile, you can't say about a wheat pile that it's all one unit. But in a way, it is one entity. If part of the bunch or part of the pile becomes impure, we may take truma from the pure elements to exempt the impure elements. The moment it becomes two cakes, two bunches, two piles, one impure, one pure, you may not at this point take truma from the pure part onto the impure part as an initial preference, only after the fact. The term trumas meiser. But when it comes to trumas meiser, which is the 10% which the Levi needs to give from his 10% which he received from the farmer, over there, even initially, you could take truma from the impure part, to exempt the impure produce. Shenamar, as it says, when it comes to trumas meiser, what does the verse say? Es mikdashai mimenu. The Levi needs to separate the holy part from it, which sounds like tel min hamekudash shabai. Torah is giving you an allowance here. Sometimes there may be in your meiser talking to the Levi now, in your Meiser there may be some sacred parts and unsacred parts, pure parts and impure parts, and you're allowed to remove just the sacred part, just the pure part, to exempt all the other produce, even if it's impure. Halacha ches, ein termin min atame alator. We said before you cannot take truma from pure produce to exempt impure produce. What about the other way? Taking impure produce to exempt pure produce? That's for sure not allowed. Because here, as the commentaries explain, you're making the Kohen lose. When the Kohen gets the truma, if it's pure truma, he can eat it. If it's impure truma, he can only use it for fuel of an oven or lighting a candle. He doesn't get any personal benefit from it in the way that regular food would. And therefore the laws are stricter. V'im taram, if you did, even after the fact, take truma from impure produce to exempt pure produce, b'sheigeg truma se truma. If you did it inadvertently, by mistake, and as we're going to see in a moment, the mistake is that you weren't aware that it was even impure, truma se truma. Then the truma is a good truma. But mezid, if you did it purposely, in other words, you were aware that it was impure, loitiken nesashirayim, you have not fixed the leftover produce. It requires truma to be taken from it again. But we're also going to penalize you, v'zeh shehedim truma. Whatever you did take as truma is going to be truma. It's got to go to the Kohen. V'yachzer v'yisram, and you must take truma again. Now that Rambam clarifies what I just said, when do we say that inadvertent, that a mistake is a reason to be lenient? Shalayada batuma. If you weren't even aware that it was impure. Avolim yada, but if you knew it was impure. V'shagag shemuter lisra min atame ala Torah, and your mistake, your inadvertence was on the fact that you thought it's permitted to take truma from impure produce to exempt pure produce, harehu kameza, that's like doing it purposely, and we're going to penalize you there too. V'chein b'trumas meiser, same law applying to trumas meiser, where the Levi takes the tithe for the Kohen. Same thing, from impure, you definitely cannot exempt pure produce. Halacha tes, ein termin min hamechubar ala talosh, v'lei min atalosh ala hamechubar. You may not take truma from attached produce to exempt detached produce, nor from detached produce to exempt attached produce. Keita, what does this mean? You had some apples, some fruits that were picked, detached from the ground. And you said, I want to take truma from these detached apples and let them cover the attached apples. Even if you said that the attached apples will be exempted only when they're picked. In other words, in the moment that the truma will go into effect, all the apples will be detached. But since you said it while it was still attached, it doesn't work. Or you had two patches of fruit or vegetables. And you said, one of the fruit patches was detached, one of them was still attached. You said, the fruit of this patch, which is detached, should be truma for the fruit of this patch, which is still attached. Or a person said the opposite. The fruits of this patch, which is attached, should be truma for the fruits in this patch, which are detached. In this case, you haven't said anything. You're trying to separate truma from attached to detached, or vice versa. It doesn't work. But if a person said, when it came to the two patches, this fruits in this patch are detached. Let them be truma for these fruits that are attached. When they'll be picked, v'nitlishu, and then they were actually picked and detached, since you had the power to detach them, when you made the declaration, the fact that right now they're attached and they haven't yet been detached isn't of consequence. It's not considered to be lacking any action. And when both of them are picked, your words will be effective. So long as when you made the declaration, they had already produced a third of their growth. Now, if you're following this halacha, there's an open contradiction between the beginning and the end. In the beginning, when the Rambam was talking about the tree, attached and detached, he said you cannot make the truma from the detached fruit, even if you say when the attached fruit are going to be picked. Right? Afilu amar lichashe yitolshu. Yet here, when it comes to the patches, when he says lichashe yitolshu, that works. The truma is effective. How does that make sense? So the commentaries explain that there's two different cases here. The first case is talking about where the attached fruit did not belong to the person giving truma. He was trying to fulfill the law that we learned about the other day, that you're allowed to give truma for your friend's produce. So his produce was detached. His friend's produce was attached. Over there, even if you say lichashe yitalshu, it doesn't work because you don't have the control as to when they're going to be picked. But in the second case, says the Rambam, the commentators explain, the Rambam's talking about it's all your own stuff. Your own detached fruit, your own attached fruit. Therefore, the Rambam adds, since in this case you do have the authority, you do have the capacity to pick them whenever you want, so you can take truma from the detached fruit onto the attached fruit, provided you say lichshe yitalshu, that they're going to go into effect when they're picked. Halacha Yud ein termin min halach ala yavesh, v'lei min hayavesh ala halach. You cannot take truma from fresh produce onto dry produce, nor from dry onto fresh. V'im taram truma se truma. After the fact, if you did so, it's still truma. What do we mean by dry and fresh? Says the Rambam Ketzad. What does this look like? Liket yara kayayim, v'liket mimenu lemachar. You have a vegetable, you're picking cucumbers. Some you pick today, some you pick the next day. Ein termin mizeh zeh. Once the day passes, you cannot take truma from one day onto the others. Unless this particular vegetable can last, it's non-perishable for 2 days. Because then they're both considered to be fresh. Or if you have a vegetable which stays fresh for 3 days, like cucumbers, so that example from before. You have cucumbers that last for 3 days. Whatever you can pick within a 3-day period can combine with Torah mizal. You can take truma from one to the other. But after that, it's already considered fresh and dry. If you have a vegetable which only stays fresh for 1 day, and you picked some of the vegetable in the morning, some in the evening, but all in the same day, that's okay. You can take truma from both onto each other. It's all considered lach, it's all considered fresh. Halacha Yud Aleph. Ein termin mi peiris shana zu al peiris shana sha'avra, v'lei mi peiris shana sha'avra al peiris shana zu. We may not take truma from produce that grew this year to exempt produce that grew last year, nor can we take truma from produce that grew last year to exempt produce that grew this year. V'im taram eina truma. Even if you did take truma after the fact, it's not considered truma. Shenemar, because the verse says, shana, shana. Tithes must be separated year by year. Now what does this mean, year by year? It doesn't mean if the produce was separated by a year's time since it's picking. There's a Jewish date on the calendar that marks the beginning of a new year for produce. And as we'll see, there's actually 2 dates, depending on what kind of produce it is. The Rambam begins with vegetables. Liket yarak erev Rosh Hashanah ad shalei ba hashemesh. A person would pick vegetables on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, 29th day of Elul, before sunset. V'chazar v'liket achar sheba hashemesh. And then he picks the second vegetable after sunset. On the screen I put Chaf Tes Elul and Gimel Tishrei, 3 days later, because Aleph Tishrei would actually be like a holiday. Rosh Hashanah, it's not so simple to pick vegetables from the ground. But the Rambam brings that out to make his point. That you can have literally a separation of 20 minutes. You picked one vegetable before sunset, one vegetable after sunset, but once it crossed the day, ein termin mizeh zeh. You can no longer take truma from one to the other. Shazeh chadash v'zeh yasham. One is new, one is old. Rosh Hashanah is the demarcation line for most produce that marks the beginning of a new year. V'cheinim likit esrog. Be'erev chamisha asur b'shvat. Ad shalei ba hashemesh. Or if a person were to pick an esrog, citrus fruit, on the eve of the 15th of Shvat, before sunset. So the 14th of Shvat before sunset. V'chazar v'liket esrog acher. Misha ba hashemesh. Then he picks a second esrog right after sunset of the 15th of Shvat. Ein termin mizal zeh. You can no longer take truma one for the other, because the 15th of Shvat is the new year for trees, and that divides the produce from 1 year to the next. Because the first day of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, is the Rosh Hashanah l'maiser tvua b'kitnis v'yirakas, is the new year for tithes as it relates to grain and legumes and vegetables. V'chamisha asar b'shvat, Rosh Hashanah l'maiser sa'ilan, and the 15th of Shvat is the new year when it comes to tithes of a tree. Yud Beis. Ein termin peiris ha'aretz al peiris chutz ha'aretz v'lemi peiris chutz ha'aretz al peiris ha'aretz. You cannot take truma from fruits that grew in Israel to exempt fruits that grew outside of Israel, nor can you take truma from fruits that grew outside of Israel to exempt fruits that grew inside of Israel. V'lemi peiris ha'aretz al peiris Surya, v'lemi peiris Surya al peiris ha'aretz. You can't even take truma from fruits in Israel to exempt fruits that grew in Syria. Syria is that area of land that was conquered by King David as an extension of the land of Israel. It was treated by the rabbis almost like Israel in many ways, but produce that grew in these two regions cannot be used for each other. From Israel to Syria, from Syria to Israel. You also cannot use, let's say you have produce which has no obligation to be tithed. For example, the gifts given to the poor, the fallen stocks, the forgotten stocks, the corner of the field. The poor people walk over to those stocks and just take them. They don't have to give any tithes to the Kohen Levi, etc. Or you have produce that already was tithed. Point is, any type of produce which doesn't have to be tithed, either because essentially it doesn't have to be tithed or because it already was tithed, you can't take more truma from there to exempt al peiris shechayavim b'truma, produce that actually is required to be tithed. Nor can you go the other way. You can't go take truma from produce which is inherently obligated to have truma taken from it to exempt already exempted produce. V'im taram ena truma. If you took truma, it's not truma. It's worthless. Halacha Yud Gimel hamafrish truma mimaiser rishayin shaloi nitla trumasei. We mentioned before a bunch of times that when a Levi gets his first tithe, his 10%, he needs to take trumas meiser, 10%, give it to the Kohen. So what if a person separates truma from produce that is really belonging to the Levi? It's part of that meiser, regular meiser, but it didn't have trumas meiser taken yet from it. Trumasei means it's truma. Trumas meiser wasn't taken from it. Or you took from the second tithe. After you give 10% to the Levi, you take 10% for yourself. It's called Meiser Sheni. We have a whole set of laws on that coming later. You have to eat it in Jerusalem in a state of holiness. Unless it's redeemed, unless the holiness is transferred. So before the holiness is transferred, you take that Meiser Sheni fruit and you want to use it as Truma, al Peiris Acheres, to exempt other fruit. Ein Truma san Truma. It's not a good Truma. Halacha Yudalid, ein termin midavar shu chayav min ha-Torah, al davar shu chayav midivreyan. In chapter 1, the Rambam told us that some produce is only obligated to be tithed rabbinically, others biblically. You cannot take truma from biblically obligated produce to exempt rabbinically obligated produce, nor can you take from rabbinically obligated produce to exempt biblically obligated produce. If you took truma, we penalize you. We say what you took is truma, and what you didn't, and even so, you must take truma again from whatever you're holding in your hands. Halacha tezvav otzitz nakuv harehu ka'aretz. In halacha, when you have a flower pot and there's a hole in the flower pot, it's whatever grows in the flower pot is considered to be like it grows on the earth. V'kama yehe banekev. How big does the hole have to be? Kedei sheiresh katan. So long as it's big enough that a small root can escape from the hole and take root in the ground. V'hu pachis mikazayis, less than an olive-sized volume. Zara tvua ba'otzitz she'enei nakuv. V'hevi ashlish. What if you planted grain in a flower pot? It didn't have a hole, and it produced a third of its growth. Then you made a hole in it while it's in the middle of growing, and it ripened while it has a hole. For the laws of tithes, it's considered as if it grew in a non-holed flower pot, unless you make the hole before it produces a third of its growth. Once it already gets to a third of its growth, it's considered to have grown in a non-holed flower pot. Halacha tezayin ha-Torah mi peres hagdelin ba'aretz al hagdelin ba'atzitz nakuv oy mi peres atzitz nakuv al hagdelin ba'aretz. Let's say you now have produce that grew in the ground directly and produce that grew in a flower pot with a hole, and you want to take truma on one to exempt the other. Truma say truma, that works because a flower pot with a hole is like the ground. Torah mishe'ene nakuv al hanakuv. But if you took truma from a produce in a flower pot that didn't have a hole, to exempt produce that grew in a flower pot with a hole, truma. So what you took is truma, but we make you take truma again from the flower pot that has a hole. If you took truma from a flower pot produce that had a hole, to exempt produce that grew in a flower pot without a hole, truma, what you took is truma, but it cannot be eaten until you separate again the truma and the tithes from a different place. In other words, we can also treat it on both sides of the coin. Halacha Yud Zayin, we introduced the concept of demai. Demai we had before a few times already, but just to get into a little more. The word demai is an Aramaic word, a composite of the words damai. What is this? And it's a reference to grain which there's a doubt about it, whether it was tithed. Specifically, it talks about grain that belongs to what's called an am ha'aretz, a person who was more ignorant in the laws, certain laws of the Torah. And when they had grain, the sages were worried that perhaps they didn't tithe it properly. Therefore, whenever this grain gets to the hands of a God-fearing Jew, a person who is fully informed, they have to take tithes again. But because it's out of doubt, it has a lesser status than when you tithe definitely untithed grain. So one is called demai. Demai is doubtful grain. One is called vadai. Vadai means definite grain, but definite means definitely untithed. So the Rambam now talks about, can you take truma from one such species to exempt another one? Ha-Torah min hadmai al hadmai. You have two piles of wheat. They're both of questionable status. Can you take truma from one to exempt the other? Umin hadmai al havadai. Or if you have two piles of produce, one is questionable and one is not questionable. It's definitely obligated to be tithed. But you're taking from the questionable to exempt the definitely unquestionable one. What you've taken is good truma, but you must go again and separate truma from each individual pile on its own. If you take truma from definitely required produce, to exempt questionably required produce. It's truma, but the other produce should not be eaten until you take again truma and maestros. Halacha yudches ein termin shibolim alachitim. We talked before about taking truma from two different species. What about if it's two different stages within one species? Stalks versus kernels. You cannot take truma from wheat stalks to exempt kernels. It's like two different species. V'zeisim al hashemen. You cannot take truma from olives to exempt oil. Va'anovim al yayin. You cannot take truma from grapes to exempt wine. V'im taram eina truma. If you did, it's not truma. Gzeir Hashem yatriach hakayin lidrech v'lichtash. If you were allowed to, and the guy would say, look, let me press all the wine I need, and I'll give the Kohen all the leftover grapes, and he'll press it for himself. You'll purposely bother the Kohen to press his own grapes and olives. Avol termin shemen al hazeisim anichbashim. But you can go a little bit the opposite. You could take truma from oil, give it to the Kohen, to exempt olives that you're planning to pickle. V'yayin ala novim la'aser san simukin. You can give the Kohen wine to exempt grapes, which you're anyways planning to make into raisins. L'maza daima, what's that like? L'toira mishnei minin she'enan kilayim zebazeh min hayafa al hara. That's like the case we had in the beginning of the chapter, where you have two species that are not kilayim, they could be planted with each other, and you're giving the Kohen the choice part and keeping for yourself the lower quality part. You're giving him the wine or the oil, keeping for yourself the pickled olives and the raisin grapes. That's okay. You can also take truma if you have two kinds of olives. Some olives you're planning to press into oil, some you're planning to pickle. You can take truma, give to the Kohen the olives that you're planning to press, and it'll exempt the olives that you're planning to pickle. You can't go the opposite. You can't give him the lower quality, the pickled olives, and keep the ones that you're going to press for yourself. You can give the Kohen unpasteurized wine and exempt your pasteurized wine. You cannot give the Kohen your pasteurized wine and exempt your unpasteurized wine. Unpasteurized wine is higher quality. You can take truma from clear wine to exempt unclear wine. It has dregs and sediment, but you cannot give the Kohen the unclear wine and exempt your clear wine. You can take truma from fresh figs to cover dry figs if you're going by number. And you can use dry figs to exempt fresh figs if you're using volume. You cannot use fresh figs to exempt dry figs in volume, because the fresh figs have less volume. Nor can you use dried figs to exempt fresh figs with the number. The underlying principle here is we always want you to give the best, most generous quality to the Kohen. The termin chitim alapas. You can take truma from wheat kernels to exempt bread, but you cannot give bread to exempt kernels proportionally. In all these cases, after the fact, if you did it, it's okay. Yutes. You cannot give truma oil to cover olives that were just pressed. Nor can you give wine to exempt grapes that are just being pressed. Because this is like somebody who separates from the same type of produce a part of it that had its work completed to exempt incomplete produce. If you took truma, it's okay. But you must go back and take truma again from the olives and the grapes on their own. Now, the first truma which you took, the original wine or oil that you gave, has the full power of truma to the point that it can impose what's called meduma. Meduma we're going to examine later in these laws. It basically means a mixture containing truma. There was truma food that fell into other food. The entirety of the mixture is called meduma, and it has to be treated like truma. So the first round of truma which you took, even though we said that you have to take truma again, the first round has the full power of truma, and it's medamas. If it falls into other produce like it, it makes them meduma. If you eat it, this truma, this wine or oil, you're liable for punishment, as you would be for any other truma. But the second round of truma doesn't have that law. It doesn't make meduma. It doesn't make you liable. If a person gave truma from oil to exempt olives that he was planning to eat, not to press, or you took truma from olives to exempt other olives that you're all planning to eat them, Or you took truma from wine to exempt grapes that you're going to eat. Or you took truma from grapes onto grapes, and they're all planned to be eaten. And then you change your mind, you're not going to eat them, you're going to press them. No need to go and redo, the truma. Halacha chaf aleph, ein termin chaymetz ala yayin, avol termin yayin al chaymetz. You cannot take truma from vinegar to cover wine, but you could take truma from wine to cover vinegar. Shahayayin v'hachaymetz min echadin, because wine and vinegar are considered one species. Haya beliber lisra min hayayin ala yayin. V'nimtza b'yadei chaymetz. If you had in mind that there's 2 barrels of wine here, you're taking truma from one wine onto the other, and then it turns out it's vinegar. Eina truma, it's not truma. Haya beliber lisra chaymetz al chaymetz. V'nimtza hachaymetz taram yayin. If you had in mind to separate truma for vinegar onto vinegar, and then it came out it was wine, truma say truma, that works after the fact. A person takes a barrel of wine, thinking that he's taking truma from wine. The nimtza chaymetz, he opens it up, tries giving it to the Kohen, boom, it's vinegar, it's spoiled in the barrel. If you knew it was vinegar before you took it as truma, eina truma, then it's no good. But if it became spoiled, vinegar, after you took it as truma, then it's a good truma, because when you took it, it was good. If you're in doubt, it's truma, and just take more truma later. Same thing if you take truma from like cucumis, that plant we saw before, and it turns out to be bitter. Here's the kishus, this guy. Kishus over here. You open it up, and it's bitter. Or avatiach, v'nimtze saruach, or you take truma from a watermelon, and you open it up, and boom, it's spoiled. Or they were found to be pecked at by birds or whatever. Or another scenario, you took a barrel of wine as truma, but it was found to be left open overnight. This is a big halacha that we're going to have a few times. It applies even today. If you leave liquid overnight open, you cannot drink it the next day. So here he separated good wine, but it was open wine. Says the Rambam, truma v'yachzer v'yisrim shnia. In all these cases, the spoiled watermelon and this wine, it's truma, but just separate later truma again. Ve'ein achas mishtein medamas bifnei atzma. Neither round of truma which you separate has the power to be midameya, said before, meduma, to create a mixture, to forbid the mixture. And if you eat either of them, you're not obligated to pay back a fifth. We're going to see in chapter 10 that if you eat truma and you're not a Kohen, you have to pay back whatever you ate plus a fifth. Here, since each truma is not really a full truma, you don't have to pay the fifth. Chav Gimel Ketza, what does this mean? Nafla achas min ala chulin. If one of the watermelons or one of the barrels of wine falls onto other watermelons or wine that is regular, eina medamas. It doesn't make the entire mixture meduma, problematic mixture. Nafla shnia lemakem acher. If the other one fell into another place, eina medamas. It also doesn't make meduma problematic mixture. Naflu shteyan lemakem echad. If both watermelons fell into a mixture of the watermelons, medames biktana shabishteyan. They create a problematic mixture based on whichever one is smaller proportionally. If a regular non-Kohen would eat both watermelons together, mishalim biktana shabishteyan v'chumsha. He pays the principal of the smaller one plus a fifth of its value. What should you do with the two initially? Give them both to the Kohen and let him pay for the bigger one. So this way you're for sure. Either way, if either one is truma, you're covered. A person checks a barrel of wine. He knows he's going to be producing a lot of wine. So he's not interested to go now, every single barrel, take truma from it. He puts away one barrel. He's like, this is going to be my truma barrel. He checks the barrel, and he leaves it on the side. He wants to keep on designating more and more of this barrel as truma, until it all becomes truma for other wine, and he'll give the barrel to the Kohen. One day he's checking it, and he realizes, hey, the whole thing's spoiled, turned into vinegar. My whole plan to give it all to the Kohen is now out the window. So here's what you can assume. The first 3 days after your initial check, it's for sure wine. Any wine to which you transfer the truma in that barrel in those 3 days, is considered to be fixed. But after 3 days, since your initial check, you have to already be in doubt perhaps it was spoiled by then. And you have to separate again a second truma. There are 3 times a year that if you make this system of putting away a barrel of wine, you have to check your wine to see if it's not vinegar. Maybe it became spoiled.
How do you check it by tasting?
Yeah. No, you're right. Just look at it. Check it. Open it up and see. Smell it. Yeah. The Eluhain, they are the following. Bakodim shal meitzoi hachag. When the east wind blows after the Sukkot holiday. Uvahitzoas hasmadar. When the grapes begin to form, the new grapes on the vines. Ubishas knisas mayim laboiser. And when fluid begins to enter the unripened grapes. Different stages of grape growth. You should go back to your wine cellar and check your wine. The yayin migitoi, wine straight from the vat, fresh off the press. Mafrishin olav becheskas shu yayin adar boyim yayin. You can separate truma based on that wine for 40 days, not just 3 days, because it's assumed to be super fresh for the first 40 days. Chavav hamaniach peiros liyes mafrish aleya nachiyasu truma. What if you put away not a barrel of wine but produce? It's your pile of produce. It's your truma pile. Every time you have more produce coming in, that's going to be the truma designation till it becomes a full pile of truma. You're going to give it to the kohen. Even though ideally you shouldn't do that, you saw in chapter 3, you're supposed to separate truma from grain in the same location. Im hifrish, if you did, you can always assume that they're there, they're extant, and they haven't been lost. Motzon sha'avdu, if you found them later that they're lost, and you have to go and suspect everything. You don't have no 3-day grace period. Whatever you used that pile to fix, you have to worry that it wasn't fixed. Maybe you only separate after the grain was lost. Therefore, for the entirety of the grain pile, you have to separate a second round of truma.